Welcome to episode number 1 of the Milkfed Crime Blotter. I am your host, Dave Slusher, and welcome my co-host for this first episode, Christiana Ellis. Welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
I am so delighted to have you along. One, because I know that you are a reader of some of the output of the Milkfed Criminal Masterminds, and the other main reason is I know that you are a rock solid podcast partner, and so I'm worried about every single aspect of this show except for you. So,
well, I'm happy to be one less item for worry.
All right. So give people kind of the capsule summary bio of yourself and kind of pointers to your stuff.
Well, as you mentioned, I'm a podcaster and a writer. I have a couple of fiction projects out there, including my fantasy novel, Nina Kimberly the Merciless, and my science fiction audio drama, Space Casey. And you can find podcast versions of both of those, as well as all of the other nonfiction podcasts I do at ChristianaEllis.com.
And my main blog and podcast is at evilgeniuschronicles.org, as it kind of says on my lower third. And in kind of a manic, the manic burst, the manic end of manic depression, you got to strike while the manic is hot. So I've started 2 podcasts this week. The other one being Mad at Dad, which is at Mad at Dad Podcast, which is myself and podcast pioneer Michael Butler, as we sort of complain about our lives. That's basically what that is. So during the dog days of podcasting this year, I threw out 3 different projects I wanted to start, and this was one of them. And so I have now brought 2 of those 3 to fruition. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this is because I am just a big fan. I think I read every single book that is that comes out from the Milkfed Criminal Mastermind imprint. I guess you would call it an imprint. I'm not exactly sure the nomenclature to use for it, but I am a fan of Kelly Sue DeConnick's work, and I'm a huge fan of Mac Fraction's work. So it just seemed like a reasonable thing to do to talk about the work. And so we're going to do, we're establishing the format here. We're kind of figuring it out. I wanted to kind of give a quick rundown of the books that came out in the month of September. So, and let's do the quick rundown of this, and then we can talk about kind of which ones we're getting. As I say, I'm getting every one of these. But in September, we saw Casanova Acedia number 4, which concluded that series, was published, as was Odyssey number 7, Sex Criminals number 12, and Bitch Planet number 5. And those were the ones that kind of came out under the Milkfed logo, as well. Hawkeye number 22 came out from Marvel, which concluded the Matt Fraction's run on that series, as well as Captain Marvel and the Carol Corps number 4 came out. So which of these series are you reading, Christiana?
So the first one you mentioned I haven't read, but I think pretty much every other one you mentioned, I certainly am a big fan of that whole Matt Fraction Hawkeye run, and the long delayed but finally arrived finale to that story was much anticipated by me, and then much enjoyed once it arrived. I'm also Captain Marvel, Kelly Sue's run on Captain Marvel. I started with issue number 1 of that, and that was how the first comics that I read by her, and so I've been following all of her Captain Marvel stuff since then. So I read the Captain Marvel and the Carol Corps tie-in as well. I'm also reading Sex Criminals. I'm also reading Bitch Planet.
Mm-hmm. And we should also mention that Bitch Planet, I actually didn't plan it out this way. I didn't even realize it was happening, but we're going to talk about the first 5 issues of Bitch Planet in this show. And in fact, the trade paperback of that was released yesterday. So that was just sort of dumb luck that we actually, the original plan was to talk about a series every show. And then I realized it made a lot more sense to talk about one trade collection each show, because we're never going to run out of those, and we will eventually run out of the series.
Mm-hmm.
And, we originally picked Bitch Planet because, being one of the shortest series, we didn't have to prepare, Satellite Sam is 15 comics to reread. So it was just sort of worked out in our favor.
Plus, it's really good, although I suppose just about everything on the list would be.
So let's talk a little bit about how you got into their work. So you said you started reading Captain Marvel and the Carol Corps, or even prior to the Carol Corps, the original Captain Marvel series that Kelly did. And how did you get into Matt Fraction? Like, what was your entry point for him?
I think probably the first book that I read knowing that it was him was the Hawkeye run, where it was a couple of issues in, and just the people that I follow, as far as comics recommendations, where everybody was saying, "Oh, you got to read this run of Hawkeye," and I picked it up and just loved it immediately. And so I think that was the first one. There may have been things that I read prior to that I didn't realize were him, but that was certainly the first one where I was aware of him as the creator.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've been in and out of comics basically since I was 5 years old, and so I spent most of the 2000s kind of in an away period, and somewhere in the late 2000s, I want to say 2008 or 2009. I can date this if we go look at this, but around the time I started getting back, and I actually decided to open a new pull box, which I hadn't had one at that point for 15 years. I was like issue 4 or 5 of Matt Fraction's Iron Man run, and so Iron Man's one of my characters, and so I started reading it. I thought, my God, this is incredible, and very quickly he became just a buy everything. Where I bought series. I bought the X-Men because he was on it, and I really have no particular interest in the X-Men other than him, and I didn't stick with it long after he left. But so he quickly became somebody that was just a name brand to me. I'm going to buy everything of his. Now, flash forward, this is not, I don't, like, I'm not doing this podcast because of Cult of Personality. I'm doing it because of the work, right? Now, the fact that I have met them and they were extremely nice and generous people, certainly doesn't hurt, but that's not the primary motivation. Heroes Con in 2012 was the first and only time I've ever done cosplay. And at the time I had a 1.5-year-old child with me, and we dressed her up in a samurai, little Japanese looking dress. And I took a stroller and I put panel contact paper, wood grain contact paper all over the stroller and dressed up in a samurai outfit. And we went as Lone Wolf and Cub. And we rolled around the Heroes Con floor. The person, now bear in mind, I have personal friends that were at that show. Not one person was more excited to see my costume than Matt Fraction. He went nuts when he saw me, and he must have talked to me. So he was not, his star was ascending, but it was not stratospheric at the time. And so in 2012, he had time to talk to me, and we must have talked for like 5 or 10 minutes about nothing but Lone Wolf and Cub. So it was really a fun time. And so I've really had a kind of a special place in my heart for everything Matt and Kelly Sue since then. Now, the fact that the work is extremely good, that might be a kind of an entry point, but that's not going to sustain for, years and years. But, that's, I have an enormous amount of affection for this family. So that's kind of my personal story. So then, and actually around that time, this was the last point where there was any Matt Fraction series that was not buy on site for me, because he handed me, this was pre-release of Hawkeye, and he handed me, while we were talking, the flyer, and it had kind of the flyer for Hawkeye with a pin, just a Hawkeye logo pin attached to it. And I took it and I thank you, and I put it in my backpack, and I thought, I just don't care about Hawkeye enough. Even with Matt Fraction, I don't care about Hawkeye as a character enough to pursue him. And so, several 4, 5 issues went by, and I heard nothing but great buzz about it. And I thought maybe I should actually try it out. And then I read it. I thought, oh my God, this is unbelievably good. Oh, me of little faith. How could I possibly have, not believe this? So from that point forward, it was nothing but faith in basically in everything Matt and Kelly Sue. Yeah. I still have to go back. I'm behind on Captain Marvel. I got some of them. I actually got sidetracked. I'm probably will go through and read most of those Marvel Unlimited. Like you, I do kind of a mix of digital. I do mostly paper. I do some digital, and then it's almost like a soft cover, hardcover situation where if I really like the digital, I'll just put it on my list to eventually get the paper when I see it. But certainly, like the Marvel output, I'm not caught up on. I bought Pretty Deadly. I have the whole run of Pretty Deadly. I have the whole run of Bitch Planet. So it's definitely on the indie stuff. I am all in on everybody. And so So there you go. And is there anything else we want to talk about the new series there?
No, although I could go into my history if you want, but or whatever, it's your show. You're calling the shots, whatever. I mean, I had been into comics briefly when I was like in high school and college, and then mostly stopped because it was too expensive at the time. And in particular, what I was starting to run into when I was living in the dorm is that it was kind of a problem to store them all. Like, what do you do with them after you've read them? And I was never particularly interested in collecting for monetary value, which, is a perfectly fine thing to do for if that's what they want to do, but it's not what I was interested in. I just wanted to read them. So I kind of fell away because it was inconvenient. And then I actually got back into comics with the New 52 back in 2011 with the DC's New 52 thing, because I realized that I could get them on my iPad, and now all of a sudden it was super convenient. So, but definitely over the last, few years since I've been heavily back into comics, I remember listening to an episode of the Comic Find podcast where the hosts just emphasized you shouldn't just follow, like you can have your favorite characters that you'll buy everything that comes out with them, fine. But what you should be doing is following creators, not just characters, because, just because you loved a particular run of one character doesn't mean that you'll still love it if it's a new person. Whereas if you did love that run, then maybe what you should do is follow that creator off to see what they're doing elsewhere. So just kind of like with the Hawkeye run and the Captain Marvel runs that I really loved both of those, following Matt Fraction and Kelly Sue DeConnick to their other projects has proved fruitful.
Yeah, absolutely it has. Okay, so let's do a real quick rundown of the news. There's not a lot. I didn't actually go back and hunt up. There was a news stories about television options. We'll talk about that more if if and when we get to the point where there's some more action on that. I know that Kelly Sue last night did a signing at Floating World Comics in Portland. That is, and it sounded like it was really well attended, and kind of a big event. That is personally meaningful to me because in the 1999 to 2000 timeframe, I worked in Chinatown in Portland, and I worked in the building next door to what is now Floating World Comics. And it makes me mad every time I hear about Floating World Comics, because I think Floating World Comics and Ground Control, like a Retrocade, I think are on the same block. And I'm like, where was that when I was literally next door to all that stuff? But and then October 23rd through 25th, I believe both Kelly Sue and Matt will be at Paris Comic-Con. So I particularly am not available to go to that particular con, but if you're in Paris, if you're listening to this and you're in Paris, they will be there October 23rd through 25th. And then the trade paperback of Casanova Acedia, which I guess is how you pronounce that, Acedia, that will be out towards the end of October. So that is the news, and we'll kind of going forward, I'll kind of collect news as we find it, to have a more robust news segment. But that's what we got this time. So let us get to the meat of things, which is what we wanted to do a deep dive on was Bitch Planet. And as we said, the trade paperback was out as of yesterday. And now bear in mind too, my friends, if you were listening to this, this will be lousy with spoilers. So if you have not read Bitch Planet, I would recommend you not listening to the next half hour. Just stop now, come back, and rejoin us when you have read it, because otherwise it might be very problematic for you. Okay, so
one additional note on that, just I think I have a slightly non-traditional view of spoilers, in the sense that my personal feeling is that they don't generally ruin the experience for me. Sure, it's nice to have surprises sometimes, but for me, it's about the execution, not necessarily just the strict description of the plots. And so I think it's quite possible if someone, if someone is already interested and doesn't want to get spoiled, they're already going to go get it, and they should. But it also might be that if someone is like, I don't know, you could listen to this and be inspired to go get it.
Mhm. Well, and then one of the things we'll talk about is by the end of episode 1, episode 1 has a really unorthodox structure, and multiple there's multiple head fakes that occur in the course of this issue, and so it is extremely well executed. And I think knowing the spoilers will not make it unfruitful to read, but there's a certain pleasure in going in cold and not, getting to experience all those reveals.
Well, definitely, yeah.
I say this as somebody who read the Portland Oregonian review of The Sixth Sense that included the crucial turn before seeing the movie, and also The Crying Game. So there's multiple movies like that I did not have the pleasure of experiencing the reveal for myself. So I'm actually maybe a little more sensitive to that because there is something there. So just speaking of broad stroke, kind of what are your overall impressions about Bitch Planet? Now, you say you're a fan, but what do you kind of take away from it, in the big picture?
Well, I think part of what makes good sci-fi is taking things that are true about our world and casting them in a slightly different light. As you shine a light on something in our world and it makes a big shadow on the wall. And I think that's what some of the best sci-fi is it's exaggerations of things that are actually going on in our real world. But it's really still coming from a place of truth. And some of the issues that are talked about, in the series, the idea of gender policing and patriarchy, oppression, racism, all of these things. It's not that they're not discussed, but I think that the more voices we can have, contributing to the conversation on these things, the better. And I think that it also, at the same time that it's talking about these real issues that are kind of heavy, it's also kind of celebrating and deconstructing the tropes of the old school, like exploitation, women in prison type of movies.
Mm-hmm.
And that is one of my favorite things in any media, is taking something that, despite maybe having problematic aspects, also has some really cool heart to it. And then taking something that can simultaneously analyze what may have been issues with it, and yet also really celebrate what's great about it. Cabin in the Woods, I think, is a great example of a movie that does that with, sort of horror movies, especially slasher type or teen horror movies, and where it can use those tropes at the same time that it talks about those tropes and analyzes them in a critical way. And I think that this book does that as well. And it's also just, it's funny, and it's kind of, gets the blood pumping. It's great.
Yeah. So starting just from the most outward thing, like you said, the visual aesthetic, starting from the covers, is very much that 70s. The same, the pulling from kind of the same pool as, say, Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez Grindhouse stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's that 70s lo-fi look, and so the dots. One of the things that I have found all the way through the series, very prominent on the covers, but also used inside. And I haven't quite, I'm not sure I've 100% pinned this down, but the use of the kind of the grainy dots is kind of an indicator. And so it kind of is a signifier of the lo-fi aspect, and the kind of, like you say, it's simultaneously futuristic, setting something, off planet, in, I don't know if it's even ever specified where this planet is. If you notice, the planet itself, we have basically zero details about. We don't know how far it is. We don't know if it's in this solar system, in another one. We don't know how much of the planet is devoted to this prison. One would assume not the whole planet. It would have to be a small planet.
The only details we have as far as that goes is that it takes a week to get there the fastest possible way. And to do that, you have to be submerged in compression jelly or something like that. And we only know that because of a character in, I think, issue 4 being told he has to go there to supervise something, and he's not thrilled about that.
Notice, so like when you start with episode 1, so beginning with the cover, you have on the front cover, you have a double middle finger. First thing you see on the inside cover is the middle finger. So already you've been flipped off 3 times before you've actually begun panel 1 of issue 1. So that sets the stage. And then I did notice, like, once the story begins, we see a character who doesn't really play, as far as I can tell, doesn't play begin that, but it doesn't play again. But this character is a toll booth, and she is extremely apologetic. And so I notice that she's, deferential and apologetic to everyone she's trying to get to. And then that kind of actually sets the tone for the book, right? There's this woman who is in this basically, what you call it? She's sort of deferential to every single creature she meets on the whole way in. And then once we get into some business, with the prison, and then the second and third page, the two-page spread, where we've basically got, like you said, in that stasis, got basically these naked women floating in stasis. So we have already got to. I'm trying to think if I have ever seen a woman in prison movie kind of that era, like Caged Heat and many kind of lesser lights. But I think I've seen Caged Heat maybe 25 or 30 years ago. I have no specific recollections. But one of the things I remember is there's pretty much always a shower scene. There's nudity. And these tropes do kind of come back throughout the series. And so, we get into the tropes, and very quickly kind of the themes are kind of set. And I thought that was a very kind of economical, very efficient entry into the series, right? By page 3, we've gotten a lot of the feeling of this.
Well, and one of the things that I think is interesting to note too about all of the nudity is that, in one sense, like you were just saying, it really ties into the visual aesthetic and the tropes of that whole women in prison type of genre and that sort of story. But there's also, like all of these different women that we see, there's a variety of different body types, of different skin colors. And it's one of the things that she talks about in the end of issue notes a number of times is the idea that even when there's a sort of I'm doing sexy in finger quotes shower scene, because there's really other things going on in that scene. They had to redo it 3 times because they were trying to be very conscious of living up to the tropiness of it, but without making it too male gazy is the term that they use. And in what they mean by that is just the sense that the point of this is not to titillate it exclusively. It's not just so, the idea that, hey, a 13-year-old kid could flip through this to look at some boobs. It's not about that, but it's still about acknowledging the reality of these women's bodies and also living up to these tropes of that's part of the whole thematic story is the idea that this society wants to reduce these women to being nothing but their bodies. And not even necessarily all of their bodies, but just specific parts generally.
And yeah, I've definitely got that in my notes to talk about future, is that is in fact some of the crimes that the women commit is not caring about their bodies, right?
Penny Roll in particular.
Right. So now I want to, so kind of early on, we've got this, one of the kind of ongoing elements of the story is this kind of floating video screen. And so I actually, maybe you can help me with that. I'm not 100% sure, like the aesthetic of it. A lot of times is this like bizarrely, like overtly sexualized cartoony character that's kind of giving instructions to the prisoners. So what do you make of that? I'm actually not 100% sure what to make of that. I'm not sure.
I think that all of those different types, like there's the one that you just showed, and then a few pages later, there's the one that the technicians refer to as the Catholic, I think.
Yeah.
Or the confessor or something like that, because it's
like a scantily clad nun, basically.
Yeah, and so there's an even closer up shot, another page, I think, or no, the page preceding that one. But in any case, the point is that I think what all of those different images are doing is they're reflections of essentially male fantasies, is the idea. And so all of these women are sent to this prison, some of them for actual like things that we would consider crimes in our society, you know, like murder. But a lot of them are really just being sent there for being, quote, non-compliant, meaning you don't act or think or talk like we think you should. And so in this case, I think a lot of these characters that are used to give instructions to the women in this place are archetypes of the type of women that they're supposed to be instead. But with also this element of the male fantasy version of the woman is the one that's going to tell them what to do because they're beneath that. Mm-hmm. And that's the impression that I get, but it's not, it's not like a one for one. I think there's a lot of just an aesthetic quality to it.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I also wanted to point out, kind of, and so we won't go on this crazy level of detail all the way through, but so I also wanted to point out the kind of garb that the guards, particularly with those masks.
Sorry.
Now, tell me your take on the mask. I kind of read that as so, and there is some discussion later on with the character who's talking about how she doesn't wear the mask. But most of the guards do, and rather than wearing kind of a flat, flat standard kind of riot gear mask, it's this kind of I should call it like the blank mask, like almost the what do you call the Greek theater mask?
Oh, I know the ones you mean, but I don't. There's tragedy and comedy, but
I kind of read that almost as as kind of bringing the subtext to text of the fact that the guards are both dehumanizing and dehumanized, right? They wear that, and it kind of reflects a sort of stripping away of their humanity, being in this role, and then also pushing that outward. So everybody involved in the transaction is being dehumanized in one way or another.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, part of what it reminds me of is the character of Nux from this summer's Mad Max Fury Road, who is he was just another one of the war boys until he actually gets separated from the pack, and then he can start to be seen as his own individual human being who has his own thoughts and feelings, and he's not just one of this horde. And then I think the guards, there's that same element. There's also just the element of if they can never know which guard they're dealing with, then they can't report anyone. So there's that anonymity that sort of gives them carte blanche of like, they want to say, hey, this guard, hit me and I wasn't doing anything. They say, which guard? And you don't know because they're wearing a mask. And so and that's actually becomes a plot point later because when the protagonist, Cam, realizes that there's one of the guards that habitually watches the women in the shower through a little peephole, she realizes that that's a way to identify one specific guy and not just a guard that you never know if you can ever find the same one again. This way they know how, like, okay, this is one guy and we know we can work with this guy. And we can blackmail him and get him to do things for us, but only because we know who he is. All the other guards, we don't. And so that's I think, another big part of what the mask is about. But there's also, like, I agree 100% with the part that you said, that it's about dehumanizing. And I think that there might be an element too, because one of the things that's easy to overlook in this type of story is how damaging all these rules and the mindsets of all this, how damaging it is to the men too. You know, it's not just about victimizing women and all the men are just hunky-dory, because there's all of these rules that, you know, like there's the bit where the one guy is being told he's to take this job to build this new structure on Bitch Planet. And he mentions that he's a little unsure about it. He maybe has to run it by his wife. And the guy he's talking to says, maybe don't want to mention that last part. Like the implication that you have to ask your wife for permission, that's the sort of thing that's going to get you out of a job, you know, that sort of idea. And having these really rigid gender policing of like, well, this is how a man is supposed to act and this is how a woman is supposed to act, can be very oppressive for men too, right? And so I think that there might be an element of shame on the part of the guys that work there. You know what I mean? Like there might be this element of somehow this is not an honorable job for a man to do. And so they're allowed masks in order to preserve their dignity. And it's, as you mentioned, then there's the female guard who is chosen to kind of directly interact with our protagonist characters. And what she mentions about not wearing the mask is that basically her job, her assignment, which she is to do as instructed, is to try to build trust with them. And they figure that's going to be easier if she's not wearing the mask. And so she doesn't get to wear a mask. Mm-hmm. So even though this is still one of the contemptible female characters in the story, because of the way she is just carrying out the will of the fathers, at the same time, she is very much caught within that system, just like everybody else. There's this impression that like she didn't get to pick this job, that she's not doing this because she loves it. She is just a willing tool of the patriarchy rather than an unwilling one. Mm-hmm.
Now let's mention a little in episode 1. So I had mentioned the head fake, and again for the viewers who are coming on late, this is extremely spoiler filled. Mm-hmm. So we kind of see our entry to the planet is kind of again. I think it's kind of a standard trope of the women in prison is that you have, like basically a viewpoint character who is probably either innocent or wrongly accused, and is relatively, what do you say, green compared to everyone, not as hard.
The good girl.
Yeah, exactly. And so we have that in the character of Marianne Collins, who is claiming to be innocent, and she comes in and she's very frightened, and she's kind of it's in a lot of ways kind of the audience surrogate, and it sets up this expectation that she is the protagonist of the series, and everything about the first 21 pages of this book suggests that she is the protagonist of this,
including we have this cross-cutting with a man on Earth who's gone to the local official saying, there's been a horrible mistake. You have my wife in custody. She's not supposed to be in custody. And so this is meant to doubly convey this argument she's making. Oh, I'm innocent. I'm not supposed to be here. And it's supposed to reinforce that through most of the story up until right at the end, when, I don't know, should I just go ahead and get to it?
Go ahead and say.
Okay, so basically what we discover at the very end is that she was insufficiently forgiving of his infidelity, and that's what got her sent here. And the wife that this guy is talking about being wrongly in custody is the new young hot wife who's only there by accident because he married her so quickly after shipping off the old wife that the warrant was still in effect.
The paperwork for arresting Mrs. Collins wasn't properly closed out, so they got the wrong Mrs. Collins, which I'll tell you, gave me a lot of a kind of a Brazil overtone.
Yeah, yeah.
That's kind of how I read that, is like it's very much a Tuttle Buttle type situation. And this started something that does not that carries through the series, is basically, again, like every husband-wife interaction in here is extremely creepy and disturbing.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, this begins with it's sort of like a what would be the opposite of idealized? It would be like a disidealized version of a 50s you leave it to Beaver-esque type,
It's like the antithesis of that.
Yeah, I mean, every one of these situations where, well, with one exception, which we'll get to in issue 4, I believe, with Mako and his wife. Every other one of these is kind of very, like, the woman is so deferential, and it's just extremely bizarre, and I think kind of meant to throw you. If I could draw a parallel, like if you like in Mad Men's season 1, I think, or season 2, there's that scene where they're having a picnic. And they just stand up and they take the blanket and they don't bother throwing any trash away. They just throw it on this pristine side of the road. And like watching that in 2015, it is horrifying. And so, when you watch this, you read this and you see this, without this, our present day sensibility, you read that and it reads as horrifying. And so it really kind of throws you off your game. It kind of puts you on the back foot as you read it.
Well, yeah. And I think one of the things that's great about the series is how it shocks you with things that are very outside our norm. But then as you kind of continue through the story and you let these various things sink in, you realize it's like I was saying earlier, that like it looks big and scary, but it's also really just the projected shadow of something that's actually real and happening all the time right now.
Right.
It's exaggerated for effect, but it's coming from a real place. But another example in that whole subplot with this guy, the husband left on Earth, that ties into what I was saying earlier about the effect that this society has on men too, is there's always these dynamics in all the men that are talking about, like, oh, who's in charge, who's the one that, like, anytime two men are talking, they have to know who's the one that's above the other one. And then there's also this element where the husband's coming in and he's trying to insist, no, it's a mistake, you shouldn't have her in custody. And the guy says, oh, I don't think so, we have safeguards against these things. And then the husband goes, then the safeguards failed. And he's mad. But then the next panel is this medium shot of just like stunned silence on both. And then the husband kind of going, I'm sorry. And just this implication of, like, it is not okay to challenge a superior like that. And so it's like, would you like to begin again? And so he's all like, oh, look, I'm sure you have safeguards, but I'm just trying to figure out what's going on. Yeah, exactly. That's the bit. And so this element where even this awful guy who basically had his wife sent away to effectively a prison planet just because she was insufficiently forgiving of his infidelity.
Right. We're not saying non-forgiving. We're saying insufficiently forgiving.
Yeah. And so, but then, of course, because this mistake highlighted a potential or perceived weakness with all of the rules and the structures surrounding how people get sent to this place, it's very important for the continued existence of this control structure that they not be perceived as making mistakes. And so when there's a mistake that could be perceived, they need to make it go away. And so that's the head fake at the end of this first issue, where the good girl, this poor wife sent to Bitch Planet, gets her throat slit in the middle of a prison riot. And then we reveal our true protagonist is the woman who was trying to help her, only to discover that this has just happened beyond her control.
Mm-hmm. And we also, so in number 1 too, we also get this set up, which you had mentioned a little bit ago, is the compliant, non-compliant. And so the non-compliant is extremely important, both in, the overarching, kind of, one of the drivers of everything in here is the women being non-compliant, but also kind of outside it in our real world amongst the fandom. This iconography is quickly taking on a life of its own.
It's bigger even than the comic book itself.
Yeah, the young women. It seems like it's 99% young women getting these tattoos and various. I've seen them with like the Captain Marvel logo behind it, and like creativity. Not just the standard stuff. And I know that like part of the pre-release collateral of this is that I think Kelly Sue had made temporary tattoos. This would be a question for her: was she surprised by how quickly those became real life permanent tattoos?
Well, this is one of the things that I really like about the books, buying them individually. Probably the trade is not going to have all of this supplemental material in the back, but the individual issues tend to have a small, like maybe a few paragraphs written by Kelly Sue, and then an essay written by a guest writer, and then lots of like letters and pictures and tweets and stuff. And so she talks a little bit about the tattoo thing in some of that, where she's basically getting at she's not going to explicitly encourage people to get tattoos because she just doesn't want to be like responsible for anyone making a decision that they maybe regret later. But at the same time, certainly there are a lot of these tattoos highlighted in people, writing in, expressing it, and just talking about how, like, for example, there's a letter from a guy basically saying he's thought that he would like one of these tattoos, but he doesn't want to be seen as taking something that doesn't belong to him, so to speak. And her response to that was that it's not about any kind of a specific thing so much as a rejection of society telling you what you're supposed to be against your own will.
All right. And so I'm sorry. I'm not cutting you off, am I?
No. Go ahead.
So I do want to kind of, so I also want to point out kind of the aesthetic of this. So I'm a good bit older than you. So I don't know if you were around for the era when you actually had this kind of crap advertised on the back of comics. But I can tell you, one of my fairly early memories is I can remember sending away for some of this stuff, and like the incredible, like Calvin waiting for his propeller beanie, anticipating getting it, followed by the enormous disappointment when you actually got this bullshit and then opened it up and you saw what it was and that you had spent however many dollars on it. Like, oh my God, I waited for 6 weeks for this. This is terrible. So there's some, so it gets disclaimed an incredible amount that you are actually buying junk. You're buying actual crap.
Well, what I think's funny is that like some of them are very clearly like jokes, but some of them are actual real things that you could buy if you send in the money that it says to the address that it says. But like some of them are like, this one is in issue 3. It's diminish with delicious Cistoda. And it's basically an advertisement for a tapeworm.
Right.
That you should have inside you so that you will lose weight. And it's basically, stop being so fat and gross, you big fatty, or maybe try not to let other people's standards of beauty or femininity or your value as a human being dictate your self-worth. If any part of you has ever been jealous or of anorexics or considered extra medical hormone injections or parasites or used body hate to bond with girlfriends, you have bought in. It's near impossible not to, but maybe today try not to believe that your value is inextricably linked to some asshat's assessment of your desirability. And yet there's also on that same page ads where you can buy the non-compliant temporary tattoos or a Bitch Planet poster and so on.
Yeah. Which, I think there's some value in just buying that stuff for the sheer novelty of it. So, all right, so let's move on to issue 2. Issue 2 is where we get the game. So one of the neat things about this is there are so many things happening at the same time. So starting with issue 2, what we begin to get is that layered on top of everything else is in this kind of stacking palimpsest of things, is that we've got it becomes a sports story, and a pretty satisfying sports story as a sports story. And so we have the game, Duamila, or colloquially called Megaton, and there. I mean, the more I read, so I reread this and kind of like, so the first time I read it, I read it episodically over the course of 10 months or something, and rereading it, quickly, I thought, this is actually really interesting as a game. So like when I reread the rules of it, I thought, I would like to see this game played.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. It's also just interesting that there's, a number of references to how the original game is called. I think you said it like Duamilia or something like that. It's basically, it's kind of a Spanish sounding word maybe. But in the Protectorate, we call it Megaton. And it's kind of just like, everyone else in the world calls it football and we call it soccer because we got our own football and it's a totally different thing.
Monster truck version of it,
Yeah. And so, but the idea that the number of players on a team can be variable as long as the total weight of all of them together is below a limit. That is the part I love the absolute most, because I started looking at this and thinking, well, there's a role for 120-pound, 5'3" guy on your team if he's extremely fast. I'm like, oh, okay, that's extremely cool. Although certainly in the images we see of the existing Megaton teams, they do seem to be mostly big, bulky guys. And that might be tied into the whole element of it being, because one of the themes in the story is that the controlling forces of this whole society have absolutely endorsed this sport as the sort of officially sanctioned bread and circuses for the people. And I think at one point there's a discussion between the female guard and our protagonist Cam about whether or not viewing of Megaton is compulsory. And basically the female guard basically is saying, it's like, no, it's not compulsory. Everyone has free will, but with free will come consequences. And so the idea that this violent sport is explicitly intended to simultaneously exalt that violent competition is a core tenet of their society's morality, but also to try to get the hoi polloi to get that out of their system without actually, say, violently overthrowing the controlling government. So let's talk a little about Cam, who Kamua Kogo is her full name. And so we kind of got the swap there at the end of issue 1. And issue 2, kind of where it really comes in, and one of the things I really noticed about this on the reread is that considering the situation that she's in, she has a surprising amount, or not that she takes a surprising amount of agency for herself. Like one person in here who can say no to things, who feels more empowered than any other character, any other prisoner character that we run across in here. And I did want to point out something that, again, this is something I didn't notice on the original read, but there's a scene where essentially they're trying to get Cam to confess to the murder of Marianne Collins, which also, by the way, means we're kind of layering a mystery story on there, because we don't know. We saw a black hand take the knife, but we don't know who it was that killed Marianne Collins. So we've got a prison story, this Brazil story, a sports story, and a mystery story all happening at the same time. So we have kind of that same figure that's in there trying to get a confession. But if you look at this, one of the things you'll notice is there are lots of pictures from inside the Collins house that are on the screen. So if you're not paying attention, you don't realize that this is very much a 1984 type situation. Right. Well, and the other, even inside their own homes. This is a great page, because one of the things that's happening in this scene is that this character is interrogating Cam, trying to get her to confess, and it's definitely one of those things where they being the capital T, they had Marion killed, and Cam is supposed to be the patsy that they get to confess by subjecting her to torture and sleep deprivation until she agrees to say that she did it. That's very clearly what's happening, right? But so everything that this confessor character is saying to try to evoke the feelings of, like, this is why you should feel bad for what you did, it's all about viewing this murdered woman as the property of her husband and son. So, like, what she's saying is like, why did you kill her? She is survived by her boy, Malachi, and a sister. So brutal. Why, Cam? Did she offend you? Were you jealous of her beauty, her skin? So there's like some of the race elements there. So alone now, her boy. He'll go to her sister, of course. She'll never have the pleasure of seeing him become a man. Why would you deny a mother that joy? What is wrong with you? Are you an animal? You did this. And in the meantime, while we're supposed to be evoking all this empathy for this poor murdered woman, you look at all of these images that, like you said, are clearly from inside the house, and about half of them are her having sex with her husband. Mm-hmm. Because clearly, from the perspective of this culture, that's what she's there for.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's extremely disturbing. And so let us move on a little bit. Now, one thing I also wanted to point out too is, so like that scene again is very much like the dot pattern, which so it kind of evokes not only that kind of that lo-fi, old school printing, but in some weird way, it kind of made me think a little about Roy Lichtenstein and kind of his pop art, which was very much kind of an emphasis on, exploding a comic book panel to so large that like all the artifacts of the printing process became kind of a design element of that art. And so it actually looked to me like, like the worst Lichtenstein ever. All these pictures of poor Marianne Collins.
Yeah. So, well, one other thing that we should just maybe briefly touch on, even though there has not been a lot of payoff for these characters yet in the 5-issue arc that we're talking about, but these two technicians that we keep cutting to here and there, we should note like that what we hear them say at the end of issue 1 is, I think we've found the star of our show. Mm-hmm. And then in this whole bit where they're trying to get Cam to confess, at one point she gets so mad that she punches through the glass in the chamber, and the two guys talk about like, wow, that's impressive. She's got spirit and everything. And what's interesting about these two guys is it would be easy on the one hand to just read them as, oh, they're the guys that control all the technical stuff here at the prison. But they also seem to be talking about something that is almost beyond what all of the other characters, even the authority figures, seem to be talking about. Mm-hmm. Because all of this discussion of, oh, let's, what we'll get into in the subsequent issues and what was brought up here, this idea of having the women of this prison form their own megaton team, basically for ratings, we see the head of the Megaton League become convinced that he is okay with this and that they should move forward, right? And yet there seems to be some other organization represented by these guys that's got some other thing going on that's dovetailing with that.
Yeah, and I kind of read them almost as a kind of a weird Greek chorus in a way.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. I think in terms of just the storytelling, that's where they're coming from now. But I'm intrigued as far as what is going to, because we really haven't gotten any payoff of those guys yet. All we've seen so far is them commenting.
Right. We don't know their names. Again, kind of in that dehumanization. We don't know their names. We don't really know anything about them. We just kind of know their role more than anything else. The only thing we know is kind of this one aspect of them. And so I think that kind of very much kind of fits with the theme of everything else. All right, so let's get into issue 3. And so, and this is understanding kind of from what she says, the cadence of this whole series is going to be basically all the third issues are going to be focused on a single character, and they'll be kind of, in the term, and they would be fill-in issues in that they're not drawn by the main artist of Valentine. How do you pronounce his name? Valentine? Probably Valentine Delandro. Yeah. I would guess. Could be Valentine Delandro again. Just the curse of the reader. I've never heard anything so pronounced, so I don't know. But so issue 3 is all kind of it shows the young life and kind of the life up to the point where Penny kind of gets herself incarcerated and sent to the ACO. So kind of what did you sort of take out of this one?
Well, what I think is great about Penny as a character is, first of all, she's just, as you showed the image, she's very big. And, she's got half of her head shaved. She's very aggressive. And, when we want to talk about being non-compliant, she almost is defining the term. Almost more than even any of the other characters, because it's one thing for other characters to say, okay, well, I'll do what you say for now while I'm plotting something else. But Penny seems to be the one that is just kind of like, she is just going to resist any attempt of any authority figure whatsoever. And what we see from her and her backstory is just this element of, for her whole life, everyone trying to tell her that she shouldn't be who she is. Like, everything that is like a natural part of her, they're telling her is wrong. And she just ultimately has the strength of character that she is not willing to take the easier path, which would be to comply. And it's just, she ultimately, we see her talking with her school guidance counselor, for example. We get the impression that, in fact, I think it's actually made explicit, although only briefly, that her father was on the run, one of his many crimes being miscegenation, because her father was white and her mother was black. We never see the mother because we're told that she was also arrested. And then her grandmother, who she was living with, is later also arrested. And the crimes all seem to be various levels of, you don't look like our society thinks women are supposed to look. And that's a problem.
And in fact, one of her crimes is wanton obesity.
Yeah, exactly. And so in this issue, there's this whole thing where she's like strapped into this room to this equipment, and she's just facing this whole panel of all of these guys that are just looking at her and like, why would you let yourself be this way? Don't you want to be attractive? What's wrong with you? And she's basically just, refusing to acknowledge that they have any legitimate authority to judge that about her. And so what we see ultimately is that she's just pushed. We see her in school, then we see her working at a bakery, and then and in that scene we see a few more examples of what this society looks like outside the prison. And what, for example, there's the feed, which is, I guess, a news show type of deal, propaganda that everyone has to put on the TV at the right time. And one character, a woman character, is like, God forbid folks use their private screens and leave the rest of us in peace. And the guy who had been complaining about it not being on says, private screens don't build community. And then he's like, did you just roll your eyes at me? And she has to go like, no. And just this realization of like, these are just two strangers who happen to be in a bakery at the same time. And she has to say, no, I didn't roll my eyes at you, because she might get in trouble if she did. And so, and that was just one of the many things that Penny is seeing around her that just makes her finally lose it and start beating on guys with a rolling pin. Part of it in particular is seeing, so she's getting increasingly mad, and then finally she just beats this guy with a rolling pin. And part of what we see, which is, I thought, a really touching bit, which is, I think, the bottom of the next page. We see what I think is it's her. No, the next page after that. We see an image of her father, and this little curl of hair that kind of goes down on her forehead, and she's constantly been trying to push it out of the way. She sees a picture of him, and he has that same little thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you move it up a little bit, the bottom panels of that page, I just thought were really the look on her face. So I know it's hard to hold there you go, a little higher, because it's, there you go. So just the look on her face as she's looking at it, and then you see she kind of puts her fingers up to the little curl, because she'd been, they'd been complaining about that. And so she just reached this breaking point of saying, look, I am who I am, and I like who I am, and I don't care that other people don't like who I am. And yet this society is telling her that is not okay. It is not acceptable for you to not care what other people think of you. And so, like, this whole idea that they're going to give her like the Zaphod Beeblebrox treatment, where it's like, okay, we're going to have this mirror that's going to read your brain and show you an image of what your ideal self would be like. And so that way we can try to say, we can help you be that person. But then when they do it, she just laughs, because it's showing her exactly how she is now. So in the sense that she is her own ideal self already, which confounds everybody, because it's like, that, well, how do we even do that? Like, so they think that the machine is broken, and then she's just like, this is a waste of time. And then we get such a great bit from her at the end of just saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Right. I ain't broke, and you bastards ain't never gonna break me. That's just a great line. Penny is a great character. She's a lot of fun.
And I do want to, and so I want to like go back to the 2-page spread where she kind of has that breakdown. So this is one of those things where it's a power of something that we get in comics that you don't get in any other medium, which is that if you look at that art, to me, it's very it's got that reminiscence of, say, a Dan DeCarlo style Archie art, where the quality of the art itself is, I think, a commentary on what's happening on the page. Where the art style is, kind of like we were saying, how a lot of this aspect of it is kind of this, faux 50s feeling to it. But in this case, it's kind of a reflection of this kind of artificial society, that even as Penny's having the breakdown, it kind of, the art looks like, a 1960s or 1970s Jughead comic, So that to me, it gives kind of an extra level of resonance on it, which I think, again, is completely unique to the comic medium.
Yeah, it's a great medium, and it's a mistake to assume that it's just like a static movie or illustrations, because I think a really well done comic and page design produces this building tension, like this spread does, of contrasting these various things around the scene, with her pounding this muffin dough harder and harder until finally she just grabs the rolling pin and smashes the screen. And then when a guy calls her a crazy bitch, she smashes him. And then, of course, the guy who was all mouthy earlier about, oh, you need to know what you're doing, and you need to turn the feed on when you're supposed to. And then all of a sudden he is pulling up his phone. He's like, I'm calling the cops on you. Your life is over. Because, of course, is he someone who could actually stand up and enforce this gender politics that he apparently thinks is the way things ought to be? No, he can't do any of that himself. he's just as dependent on authority figures as anybody else.
Right. And then like Penny's key quote is like the panel after that, which is he says, "Your life is over," and she says, "I didn't much like this life anyway." So
yeah.
So okay, so moving on. So issue 4. So I'm going to try to pick up the pace just to get a little bit long. So in issue 4, so that has kind of what we were talking about before, where it's got the shower scene that does dual work of kind of, so now we've got your 70s woman in prison shower scene in there, but there's actually a lot, like a big chunk of plot happens during this, and in 2 ways, right? So you had mentioned before kind of the guard, this being a way that they can get one over on the guard, but you know, it also, like, there's a bunch of information. It's basically an info dump in the middle of this like girl shower makeout scene, which I think is really funny. And then later on, Cam goes and like you said, uses the shower, like the most explicitly lurid imagery of it is actually kind of like a honeypot trap to get that guard. And so the end result of this is that she now has that guard owned. And in fact, not only is this guard in his pocket, but now she told him, make sure that you get assigned to the Megaton unit, because I need you. You're on my team and we're in this together. And I thought that was so at this point, you know, she has, you know, over the course of very few issues, right? Because none of these characters are even in issue 3. So this is really only the 3rd issue with this character, or the 2nd really with her as the main protagonist. And she's already basically running things, and she actually has power over the guards. And I thought that was really notable that, you know, in a very, very short time, we see, like I said before, she's the character with agency, you know, more so than any other prisoner.
And one of the things that there's a lot of interesting things going on here, because first of all, we've got a couple of layers to the mystery, namely, like the whole premise of them, hey, let's have the women form a Megaton team. Like, it sounds like a terrible idea just right on the face of it. It sounds like, yeah, let's get together all of the most aggressive and uppity women of this facility to go get their asses beat by a bunch of professional athletes, you know, who fight all the time and do this. So let's get a bunch of untrained women to get beaten up and to prove that they really are not all that tough. And like, that seems like the whole ulterior motive behind the whole thing. So why would Cam agree? Well, there's a couple of things going on. On one hand, it seems like there's some of these other characters who are talking about, gosh, if we had this exhibition game, an awful lot of important people might be there, and then maybe we could make something happen with that. And then there's also this element where she agrees to help form the team because they'll give her a list of all the inmates, and she's trying to find her sister. So, but you know, this specific scene with the guard, it ties into the mask thing again, because once she gets this guy's mask off of him, and she's basically threatening him, that saying, now that I know that you are the one that's been doing this, I know who you are, I can identify you. That's why I can threaten you now. But if we think about it, these guards are not completely able to act with impunity. The fact that she is able to successfully threaten him with, I will tell people that you're doing this. And what she says is, your ass will land in a pervert camp, if she tells. And so that's where we see that is a threat that means something to him, which is just an indication that even he, as the guard that supposedly has all this power, and we've seen the guards with their masks do some pretty awful things already, but we realize that in a lot of ways they're as trapped by the system as anybody else. You know, this idea of he has his own, you know, urges that would be seen as shameful, and so he has to keep them a secret, or else he'll be sent to a pervert camp, because apparently that's a thing.
And I did also, so like the idea of identifying this guard by the freckles on his penis. Did you get a Bill Clinton vibe out of that?
I didn't directly connect to that, but I guess, yeah. Just the idea, though, that it would be a very personal identification that he wouldn't be able to deny, and that it would be humiliating and embarrassing to even,
right. That was,
have it come up.
Yeah, that was the first, that, and so there was that kind of the Bill Clinton. So there's a lot of very subtle, I don't know if it's just me reading a lot into it or if these are kind of deliberately placed. It may just be that, because of the milieu, it's open enough that I can just bring whatever to it, and it feels like it belongs there. The other thing is this whole scene reminds me of Porky's, which you might be too young to have been through the Porky's thing. But I was exactly of an age where we're supposed to watch this movie that was so incredibly salacious. And it had a scene a lot like this, right? Where there's a guy looking in the girl's shower, so it was supposed to be salacious. And if you watch it, it is the opposite of salacious. If you somehow find a pleasure, purient pleasure in Porky's, you've got something seriously wrong.
Well, what's interesting is just how some of those types of movies, how they age relative to each other. Because I think a perfect example of that is actually Revenge of the Nerds, which does a lot of things that are really interesting, but you watch it today and it's really hard to ignore that from a gender perspective, it's really awful. And that these nerd heroes are really just as bad as the jocks that they're, pitting themselves against. I mean, the hero of the story has sex with a girl under false pretenses, which is essentially rape. They win this whole contest by putting naked pictures under whipped cream and selling it as a pie. They go on, panty raids. Like now, it's like the thing is, on the one hand, can there be humor in stuff like that? Okay, sure. But at the same time, it's also just like a lot of their behavior in that movie was not intended to be seen as shocking. It was supposed to be seen as like college hijinks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, and then also kind of, so let's move on to issue 5, and we'll kind of get to some kind of deliberately. So from the unintentionally disturbing to the deliberately disturbing.
Yeah.
So like in 5, we get a little more discussion kind of the existing Megaton League. And I noticed that one of the teams is listed as the Arizona Wetbacks. Yeah. And so that too is another indicator that this is, in some ways, like this is that kind of I don't know what you call it, but that like white male power type guy, like the guy who feels oppressed by political correctness. This is kind of his world, right? I don't know what you call that guy though. I don't know what you call it. There's a term for it that I'm blanking on, but like the male supremacist type guy. And so the guy who wishes he could, use the word nigger and is oppressed, but because he can't, and that sort of.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too that the other team that the Arizona Wetbacks were going to play is the Florida Men.
Right.
Which is like, what a weird name. But yeah, and like on that same bit, like this head of this sports league, when he has a Japanese subordinate coming to visit him, he does this exaggerated like Makoto-san, and then he's like bowing and saying arigato Mac. And it's one thing like within context and all this, and like what we've seen from this guy, it would be one thing if it was intended to be a sincere respect for someone else's culture and an attempt to greet them in a gracious way. But it is totally not that. It is about this guy who is important and thinks he's funny, says, "Hey, you're Japanese, right? This is the sort of thing Japanese people do, right?" Mm-hmm. And that's all it is.
Right.
And so it's exactly kind of what you're saying. It's this guy who just like, he has all the power, and yet he doesn't think of him like he thinks that he's just right, and it's not it's not that he's just privileged. It's just like, well, no, I'm just the one that understands how the world works. And if they don't figure it out, that's on them. That's, you know, like the bit where he's saying later, like, so the guy who's coming to see him is basically saying, you're only giving me six weeks for this team to like form and practice and become a team that's going to play professionals. And the guy just goes, bah, diet and exercise, drills and scrimmages. You'd be surprised how fit you can get when you don't have a job. And then the guy goes, they're prisoners. It's like, they made choices and they live with the consequences, just like the rest of us. I chose to work more than I golf, and now I've got this to contend with. And then he kind of holds his belly and then says, consequences follow, as though any of that is equivalent. Yes. Yeah.
And I do want to point out something, which it's one of these things that I would not be surprised if this kind of pays off and turns out to be something that's more significant later. But there's just this quick 2-panel thing.
Oh, yeah.
Woman who's going into she's in the background basically doing like a Today Show style where she flashes and she's got Eleanor Lives written on her chest. As she's flashing the camera. But then the funny thing is, so next page is in Josephson. You know, as you look at the feed, you see that there's a news story about this Eleanor movement. And is it some sort of terrorist plot? Yeah. And so it's actually subtle enough that, you know, if you're reading quickly, you could miss it. And I'm wondering if there's going to be a whole Eleanor, you know, an Eleanor movement.
I think there is, because the back cover of this page, I happen to know that the next story arc is going to be called President Bitch, which is what we see on this back cover, and it looks like it is it's a campaign poster saying Eleanor for America with the face ripped off of the poster. So that would seem to be who Eleanor is, and I would imagine we.
You know, and I did not notice the Eleanor under the. I only noticed the top, and I never noticed it was Eleanor underneath it. So there you go. That's.
Yeah. I don't even know necessarily if this was the exact intent, but what is written right under where Eleanor's face would have been is violin lessons, which what that conjures in my head is maybe not what it would conjure for everybody, but it makes me think of this old classic SNL Weekend Update bit where I'm here today to talk about violins on television. I think there should be more violins on television. Classical music is great. And it's like, I think they're talking about violence. Oh, that's different. So I don't know if that was what they were actually going for and having violin lessons be right there where her face was, but that's kind of what it made me think of. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's really interesting, like you said, how they kind of subtly plant some seeds there like that. So this comic, despite having, like you said, sort of this lo-fi look, really does reward looking into some of those finer details and some of those big spreads. Like when you see a whole bunch of screens in the background, what are they showing? And, you know, there's a lot of thought put into all those.
Yeah, absolutely. It rewards. And I found this out, you know, so typically I would not reread a comic like this, right? I reread this comic specifically for you and I to have this conversation. Mm-hmm. But, you know, if anything, one of my problems in reading comics is that I just read them too fast. You know, that I read them, you know, 80%, and I think this is not uncommon of the modern comic reader, right? 80% of my time reading is kind of going through the dialogue, and I glance at the art, which in a lot of ways is a tragedy when you think about how long the artist spends. It takes them basically their whole life is, you know, 12 hours a day drawing this comic, and you know, I'm spending, 12 seconds a page looking at that art. Yeah. Which is kind of sad in the bigger scheme of things, but it is great that there is so much going on that I think that this is a comic that should be routinely reread for specifically that reason, because like you said, there's the spoiler level where you go through and you read it and you get the story, and then there's the second read where you don't have to focus. You now can focus your attention on everything else, all the peripheral stuff that your eye was getting drawn away from the first time. And
right.
And going back to comics, and again, this is, I think, before your time, but this, in a lot of ways, this comic reminds me of the early days of American Flag by Howard Chaykin, which is significant because he also draws Satellite Sam, which I believe you also read, right?
I have not actually read Satellite Sam.
So he is, he draws one of the other comics in the Milkfed, but it was also kind of a dystopic future that was, media drenched, and there was very much a similar thing where you had to look at what was on the screens, and so I do get a certain kind of, some resonance of that. It's not slavish or anything, but certainly as someone who has read both of the series, I can see that there's, a little bit of kind of the DNA of that series in this one. Either that, or I see, having read it at 14 or 15 when I did, that I see that in everything because I imprinted on it like a baby duckling. So, so I did also want to mention, so we get this thing where, it's almost like the standard, cliche reveal where you get a lot of characters, we get them, their name, and the crimes they committed. And I wrote a few of them down just because I think it's notable. So you had the character Kat, and her crimes were seduction and disappointment, emotional manipulation, assault. And then when you get to the character of Nut, her crimes were patrilineal dishonor, murder. And note the ordering of that. Right? Murder, it didn't lead with murder. It led with patrilineal dishonor and then murder, which, both the juxtaposition and the ordering kind of are kind of undermining the fact that, that they're burying the lead that there's a murder here. Alika's only crime that was listed was disrespect. And Daniel's only crime listed was bad mother. And so that in its own.
And there was Marilyn Gunning, who is listed as trisomy 21, which is just a genetic disorder. All that is. It's Down syndrome specifically. Yeah, I looked it up. I didn't have that memorized, but
so the fact that these are the crimes that you can get put in here for, another level of, so to me the juxtaposition of the serious crimes and what we would consider the trivial crimes is another another level in here, like showing how bad things are, that these things are kind of put on equal footing, right?
Yeah.
Dishonor and murder, are 6 of one, half a dozen of the other.
Well, and then I think that there was the twins too, where like there wasn't even a crime there. It was just that they were like unpermitted birth, genetic error, interred at request of family.
Right. The burden of proof to get you in here is extremely low. Like, we don't want you around. That's enough.
Yeah. And so this issue also, I think, not that we didn't have anything happening before, but I think everything up to this point is really kind of setting the stage more than driving the plot. And I think this is the first issue where we really are starting to get a hint of what the larger plot movement might start to be. Like, what are the next steps? Because, of course, we have this one architect who is being directed to go and oversee the building of the facilities where this game will be played. But he also has this ulterior motive that his daughter is there. And he hopes that maybe he'll be able to see her. And yet the tragedy, of course, is that what we're also seeing parallel to that is unequivocal demonstration that there is no intent whatsoever for the officials to have this be a fair game.
Right.
There was, and likely that there was never any intent for it to be fair. It was never going to go that way. And then as a result of the guards, being rough and breaking the rules and not getting called on it, Mako is killed. And she is the daughter that this architect was coming to see. So we'll have to see what the fallout of that is.
And I believe issue 6, which will be the first issue of the next arc, I believe is devoted to her.
Yeah, I believe that's correct. Yeah.
So like you say, that's The other thing too, I kind of got a resonance of that, when we got to that with the playing of the game and kind of the unfairness, you got you kind of some, the 70s were also full of this kind of sports movie, right? Thinking of The Longest Yard and movies like that. It was not an uncommon situation, like the underdog sports movie,
Bad News Bears.
Yeah, Bad News Bears, the football scene in MASH and things like that. So that again, as a guy of my age, I'm reading this more than one way. I'm reading this kind of, there's a nostalgia layer on top of this, on top of the literal text here, which it makes the whole thing, like I say, extremely rewarding. There's so much on. There's like we said, there are at least 6 different reasonable readings of this series so far. All of which pay off, and that seems to me like that would be extremely difficult to do. I mean, you're the writer, so how do you, as a writer reading this, kind of what do you see for what Kelly Sue is doing, and kind of, and Valentine for what he's putting into the art.
Well, I think that there's definitely evidence of outlining beyond what I usually do in my stuff, but just that you can see the groundwork being laid for so many things that seem like they're going to come back in the future. And just and this is less about like storytelling structure as much as I think just skill in her voice, is that capturing this tone, like I mentioned earlier, of simultaneously celebrating and deconstructing all the tropes of these old school exploitation, women in prison type of movies, and using that to really say something about our society today. Because I think that's, obviously we're talking about, this is a whole other planet where this prison happens, and there's spaceships and robots, or I guess we haven't really seen robots, but all sorts of science fiction-y things. And yet the best science fiction is generally actually, the subtext is about the world that it's being written in.
Right. The interesting thing is, like we said, the planet is extremely, the details are very sparse. So the planet itself is kind of like the equivalent of a 70s Doctor Who cardboard set, right? Because, we have all this world building in the society, and like the physical world building's not even there. We don't even need it, right? It can be entirely hand waved away. Like we said, we don't know what solar system this planet's in. We don't. It is not at all relevant to the plot. How whether that's here or Alpha Centauri or who knows, who cares? That is so completely irrelevant that there's no point in even exploring any of it. So that's really, really interesting to me. Okay, so kind of summation and final thoughts. Taken as a whole, kind of, what do you feel about the series?
I like it a lot. It's really just, it's something that it's an interesting balance of feeling good to read and being entertaining, but also having that element of, you always have to be careful when feeling righteous anger, because that can easily turn into problems of its own. But there's an element of, there's an element that can feel good in sort of common recognition of something that is wrong, and saying, we think that that's not okay, and we want to say so. And that can feel good, right? And so there's an element of that too, but without getting to the point where I think it doesn't feel preachy. And I think the use of the women in prison tropes and that whole sort of tawdriness, grindhouse flavor to it keeps it from feeling too heavy-handed, even as it's pretty extreme. It becomes satire in a really sharp way.
Yeah, and so we didn't even really we talked kind of in the pre-show a little about the feminist themes and some of that, and kind of the male experience versus the female experience, and so like in the final analysis, I that's kind of sort of a second order effect of reading this, and not as interesting as the text itself. But I will know that like I was like even in this discussion about it, I was extremely conscious the whole time we were talking. Like, am I mansplaining?
Mhm.
Like, am I condescending? Because am I because I mean you know me well enough to know I don't have ill intent, but I may very well have some unexplored thing that I bring to the table that's just
Mhm.
part of the cultural backdrop that I don't even think about, which is the text of this, right? The guy who says, "Are you rolling your eyes at me?" That's his cultural backdrop, is a woman doesn't roll his eyes. And so I in a lot of ways I am kind of hyper conscious of that as we're discussing this series. And then so I think that's probably a good thing. But I agree with you. I like all the aspects of it, and like I said, I really like am impressed by and very I admire very much the storytelling that has so many different things happening. I know that it's not easy to layer things like that and make, like I say, make a satisfying sports story at the same time as a satisfying mystery and a satisfying nostalgia trip.
Yeah.
So that's very impressive, and the art is impressive. And I forgot to mention by name. I think Robert Williams, is that who drew the art in issue 4?
Maybe I'm not sure.
Yeah. So
I'm a bit like you were saying earlier, in the sense that often my tendency is to focus more on the writer than the artist, and so I sometimes will know who wrote it but not who drew it.
right. Yeah, and I'm very much in that camp as well. But so I guess we'll call it there. I tried very much. I didn't want this to be another late night death march, as I have put you into in previous podcasts. But
No death marching. No death marching.
Right. So thank you very much, Christiana. And again, kind of tell us where people can find more about you and kind of find your work.
Well, you can find everything I do at ChristianaEllis.com, including a weirdly informal, I don't know what the hell this is type of project where I am doing a 5-minute video first thing in the morning every single day called 5 More Minutes. And that gets posted both at ChristianaEllis.com and on my YouTube channel, which is just Christiana Ellis.
All right. And again, I'm Dave Slusher, and my personal blog is at evilgeniuschronicles.org, which also includes the longest running podcast in the world, 11 plus years at this point. And a new podcast called Mad at Dad, which is at madatdadpodcast.com. And the show notes for this, and you can subscribe, and iTunes and all that stuff will be up shortly, will be at Milkfed Crime Blotter. And I did not realize when I was setting all this up, what a tongue twister. I might have thought twice about naming it something different. Milkfedcrimeblotter.com. And so you can subscribe to the RSS now. I'll submit it to iTunes, as soon as we have an audio episode. The plan is to have every episode, available via YouTube and live stream, and then it will be available in audio later. So whatever your medium of choice, you can go and get it there. And so thank you so much for kind of helping set the cadence and set the bar for everyone that comes later. And you are welcome to come back every time. The goal of this is to have a rotating set of co-hosts so that I don't burn any one person out, but you have an open invitation. So thank you. All right. And thank everyone for listening. And we'll catch you again next month in November with the next episode of Milkfed Crime Blotter. Catchphrase goes here to come to be determined later. Bye, everybody. All right.